The first time I heard Japanese spoken in a hospital ward instead of shouted across a battlefield, I froze in the doorway like I'd been hit by sniper fire. It was September 3rd, 1944, and I was standing at the entrance to Ward 7 of the field hospital on Saipan, watching American medics try to communicate with a dozen wounded Japanese prisoners using hand gestures and broken phrases that made no sense. One prisoner, a young soldier with a shattered leg and eyes that held more pain than any 19-year-old should know, was crying out in Japanese, "Mizu, Mizu kudasai," water. He was begging for water in the language my grandmother had taught me, the language I'd been raised speaking in the little Tokyo neighborhood of Los Angeles, the language I'd been trained to use as a weapon against the enemy. And now the enemy had the same face as mine, spoke the same language as my family, and was suffering just like any American boy bleeding on a hospital bed. I am Sergeant Kenji Nakamura, 402nd Regimental Combat Team, United States Army. Before the war redefined everything, I was just Kenny, a second-generation Japanese-American kid from Los Angeles who played baseball, listened to Benny Goodman, and dreamed of becoming a doctor. My parents came from Hiroshima. My grandparents taught me to write kanji characters, and I grew up balanced between two worlds, Japanese at home, American everywhere else. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and suddenly having a Japanese face made me the enemy in my own country. My family was sent to Manzanar internment camp, our home confiscated, our loyalty questioned despite 3 generations of American citizenship. And I, desperate to prove I was American, furious at being imprisoned by my own government, determined to show that Japanese blood didn't mean Japanese loyalty, volunteered to fight the very people who looked like my grandfather. But standing in that hospital ward, listening to wounded Japanese soldiers crying in the language of my childhood, I realized that war wasn't going to be as simple as Americans versus Japanese, us versus them, good versus evil. It was going to be infinitely more complicated, more painful, and more personally devastating than anything I'd imagined. Let me take you back to the beginning, so you can understand how a Japanese-American soldier trained to kill Japanese enemies ended up becoming their translator, their advocate, their bridge to survival, and how that experience shattered and rebuilt my understanding of identity, loyalty, and what it truly means to be human. I was born in 1922 in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles, back when Japanese, Mexican, Jewish, and Russian families all lived together in that working-class part of the city. My father, Hiroshi Nakamura, ran a small produce market. My mother, Yuki, was a seamstress. They'd immigrated in 1910, part of the wave of Japanese laborers who came to California looking for opportunity. Papa believed absolutely in the American dream. "Kenji," he'd tell me in his heavily accented English, "you are American boy. You study hard, work hard, be good citizen. This country gives opportunity Japan never give us. You honor that with your life." But Mama kept our Japanese heritage alive at home. She taught me to speak proper Japanese, not the immigrant mix that many second-generation kids spoke. She taught me to read hiragana and katakana, to write simple kanji, to understand the cultural nuances that made someone truly Japanese instead of just Japanese-looking. I grew up in both worlds seamlessly. At school, I was Kenny, baseball player, science club member, straight-A student who wanted to go to UCLA and study medicine. At home, I was Kenji, respectful son who sat properly at dinner, practiced calligraphy, and learned Japanese poetry from my grandmother who lived with us. The two identities never conflicted until December 7, 1941. I was 19, a sophomore at UCLA studying pre-med, when news of Pearl Harbor spread across campus. Within hours, the atmosphere toward Japanese students changed completely. Classmates I'd known for years looked at me with suspicion. Professors who'd praised my work suddenly questioned my presence. By the end of the week, the FBI had visited our home, searched our belongings, and designated my father as a potential security risk because he'd sent money to relatives in Hiroshima. The next 3 months were a nightmare of increasing restrictions. Japanese couldn't travel more than 5 miles from home. We had to observe curfews. Our bank accounts were frozen. Then in March 1942, Executive Order 9066 was issued, and everything ended. "You have 1 week to settle your affairs," the notice said. 1 week to sell or store everything we owned, to close Papa's store, to abandon the home we'd lived in for 20 years. 1 week before, we were shipped to an internment camp in the desert. Manzanar was a city of tar paper barracks, surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers and searchlights, sitting in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains. 10,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them American citizens, imprisoned without trial or charges, simply because of our ancestry. The irony was crushing. My family had done nothing wrong. Papa paid his taxes. I'd never even been to Japan. My younger siblings had been born in Los Angeles County Hospital. But we were imprisoned anyway, treated as enemy aliens in our own country. Our loyalty assumed to be with Japan simply because of our faces. I spent 6 months at Manzanar watching my father age 10 years, watching my mother's spirit break, watching my younger brother and sister grow up behind barbed wire. The anger, the humiliation, the desperate need to prove that we were American, these emotions consumed me. Then in January 1943, the government announced they were forming a Japanese-American combat unit. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team would be composed entirely of Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, who would fight in Europe to prove their loyalty while their families remained imprisoned in camps. The contradiction was obscene. The government didn't trust us enough to live freely, but trusted us enough to die for America. They imprisoned our families but wanted our blood to prove we were loyal. I volunteered immediately. "Kenji, why?" my mother cried when I told her. "They put us in prison and now you go fight for them." "Because they need to see that Japanese blood doesn't mean Japanese loyalty," I answered, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Because I'm American, Mama. This is my country, even when it treats us wrong." What I didn't say was that I also wanted to fight Japan. I was angry at the country that had started this war, at the culture that made Americans fear us, at the face I saw in the mirror that made me suspect in my own homeland. Fighting Japanese soldiers felt like a way to prove I wasn't one of them, that American citizenship meant more than Japanese ancestry. I trained at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, with the 442nd, 3,000 Nisei soldiers, all desperate to prove our loyalty, all carrying the weight of imprisoned families, all ready to die to show we were American. The white officers didn't trust us at first. The local townspeople treated us with open hostility. But we trained harder than any unit in the army because we had more to prove. During training, they discovered I spoke fluent Japanese, not the broken immigrant Japanese of most Nisei, but proper Japanese thanks to my grandmother's teaching. The army immediately assigned me to the Military Intelligence Service language program. "Nakamura," Captain Henderson told me, "we need soldiers who can speak Japanese for interrogation, translation, and intelligence work. You're being transferred to MIS training." I spent 6 months at the Military Intelligence Service language school at Camp Savage, Minnesota, learning military Japanese terminology, interrogation techniques, and how to translate documents and interpret conversations. They were training me to use my Japanese language skills as a weapon against Japanese soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same language that had made me suspect that my family spoke in internment camps while Americans feared we were plotting sabotage was now valuable because it could help kill Japanese soldiers. America wanted me to be Japanese enough to understand the enemy, but American enough to destroy them. By August 1944, I was assigned to the Pacific Theater, specifically to Saipan, which American forces had captured in July after a brutal month-long battle that killed 30,000 Japanese soldiers and 3,000 Americans. My job was intelligence work, interrogating prisoners, translating captured documents, helping American commanders understand Japanese military tactics. I thought I was ready. I'd spent 2 years steeling myself to face Japanese soldiers as enemies, convincing myself that their Japanese faces didn't make them my brothers, that speaking the same language didn't create kinship. I was American. They were the enemy. It was that simple. Then I walked into that hospital ward on September 3rd and heard wounded Japanese soldiers crying for water in my grandmother's language, and everything became impossibly complicated. The senior medical officer at the field hospital was Major Robert Patterson, a doctor from Iowa who'd been treating wounded since Guadalcanal. He grabbed me the moment he saw me standing frozen in the doorway. "You're Nakamura? The new interpreter? Thank God. We've got 12 Japanese wounded and we can't communicate with any of them. Half are dying because we can't figure out what's wrong beyond the obvious injuries." He pulled me into the ward, and I found myself face to face with Japanese soldiers who could have been my cousins, my neighbors from Little Tokyo, my classmates from UCLA. Young men with Japanese faces, wearing enemy uniforms, bleeding on American hospital beds, while American medics tried to save their lives. The soldier who'd been crying for water looked at me with desperate hope. Anata wa Nihonjin desu ka? Are you Japanese? The question hit me like artillery fire. Was I Japanese? I had a Japanese face, spoke Japanese, understood Japanese culture, but I wore an American uniform, had sworn loyalty to America, had family imprisoned by America for being too Japanese. I am American soldier, I answered in Japanese, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. I am here to translate. What do you need? Water, he gasped. Please, water. They won't give me water. I turned to the medic standing nearby. He needs water. Why hasn't he been given any? The medic, a young kid from Texas named Billy Morrison, looked uncomfortable. Orders were to stabilize them, but not to make them comfortable. They're prisoners, Sergeant. The brass doesn't want us being too nice to Japs. The word hit me like a slap. Japs. The same slur I'd heard thrown at my family, at me, at every Japanese American trying to prove our loyalty. Now it was being used for these wounded soldiers who were technically my enemies. They're wounded prisoners under the Geneva Convention, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger rising in my chest. Get him water. Now. Over the following days, I learned the stories of these 12 Japanese prisoners, the only survivors out of nearly 300 wounded Japanese, who'd been in that sector when American forces overran their position. Most wounded Japanese soldiers had committed suicide rather than surrender, following the code that said capture was the ultimate dishonor. These 12 had been too badly wounded to kill themselves, or had been unconscious when captured. There was Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto, 19 years old, from a farming village outside Osaka. He'd been drafted 6 months earlier, given minimal training, and shipped to Saipan where American artillery had shattered his leg during the final defense of Mount Tapochau. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, 22, a schoolteacher from Kyoto who'd volunteered out of patriotic duty and now lay dying from shrapnel wounds to his abdomen, crying for his mother in the nights when pain made him forget his training about dying with honor. Sergeant Yoshio Kobayashi, 28, a career soldier who'd fought in China and was missing his right arm from an American flamethrower attack. He maintained rigid military bearing despite his pain, refusing to show weakness even though he was dying of infection. Each one had a story. Each one spoke the language of my family. Each one had dreams, families, fears that were universal, even if their uniforms said they were my enemy. And I was supposed to interrogate them, extract military intelligence, treat them as sources of information rather than as human beings who were suffering. Major Patterson pulled me aside after my first week. Nakamura, I need you to do something beyond translation. These prisoners are dying, not from their wounds but from giving up. They've been taught that surrender means dishonor, that being captured is worse than death. They're refusing treatment, refusing to eat, just waiting to die. What do you want me to do, sir? Talk to them, not as interrogator to prisoner, but as, as someone who understands their culture. Convince them that surviving isn't dishonorable, that accepting medical treatment isn't betraying their country. We're trying to save their lives, Nakamura, but they won't let us unless someone they trust tells them it's okay. That night, I sat beside Corporal Yamamoto's bed. He was 19, the same age I'd been when Pearl Harbor happened. He could have been my younger brother. Yamamoto-san, I said in Japanese, using the respectful form, why do you refuse treatment? The doctors can save your leg. He turned his face away. I have brought shame to my family by being captured. The only honor left is to die quickly. Is there honor in wasting your life, I asked, in dying when you could live, in never seeing your family again when you could return to them? You do not understand, he said bitterly. You are American. You do not know what it means to be Japanese, to carry the duty to... I am Nisei, I interrupted. Second-generation Japanese-American. My parents are from Hiroshima. My grandmother taught me Japanese. I know exactly what it means to carry duty, honor, obligation to family. He looked at me with shock. You are Japanese, but you wear American uniform. I am American, I said, but I am also Japanese. Both things are true. Just as you can be Japanese soldier who accepts medical treatment and lives with honor instead of dying for nothing. Over the following weeks, I became more than a translator. I became a bridge between two worlds. I explained to American medics why Japanese soldiers refused pain medication, showing weakness was shameful, why they wouldn't eat certain foods, ritual purity concerns, why they became agitated at certain times of day, missing their daily rituals and prayers. I explained to Japanese prisoners why Americans treated wounds a certain way, why they were being kept alive instead of being executed, why surrender didn't have to mean eternal dishonor. But the work was destroying me psychologically. Every day, I wore an American uniform and spoke Japanese. I translated for American doctors trying to save Japanese lives. Then I translated for American intelligence officers trying to extract information that would kill more Japanese soldiers. I was too Japanese for Americans and too American for Japanese. The wounded prisoners saw me as a traitor, a Japanese man who'd betrayed his heritage to serve the enemy. The American medics saw me as suspect. How could they trust someone who looked like the enemy and spoke their language fluently? The breaking point came in October, when they brought in a new prisoner. Lieutenant Kenji Ito was 26, a career officer from a samurai family, wounded by grenade shrapnel during a banzai charge that had failed spectacularly. He was educated, spoke some English, and carried himself with the rigid bearing of someone who'd been raised in traditional Japanese military culture. When I approached his bed to introduce myself as translator, he spat at me. "Hancho," he said in Japanese, using a word that meant traitor, sellout. "You disgrace your ancestors. You wear the uniform of the enemy and speak our sacred language for them. Better to have been born American than to be Japanese and betray your people." His words hit harder than any bullet I'd faced in combat. This was my nightmare. That being American meant betraying my Japanese heritage, that I couldn't be both, that choosing one meant destroying the other. "I am American," I said, keeping my voice steady. "My parents are Japanese, but I was born in Los Angeles. America is my country." "America that puts Japanese in prison camps?" he shot back, and I realized he knew about the internment. Japanese intelligence had learned about it and used it in propaganda. "America that treats you as enemy because of your face, and still you serve them?" "Yes," I said, though the word felt like swallowing glass. Because being American isn't about race or ancestry. It's about choice, about loyalty to principles even when the country fails to live up to them. "Pretty words," he said bitterly. "But you are still Hancho, still traitor. You help America kill Japanese soldiers, soldiers who could be your cousins, your brothers, your own father if he had stayed in Japan." That night, I couldn't sleep. Lieutenant Ito's words echoed in my mind, mixing with my own doubts about identity, loyalty, and where I truly belonged. I was American. I'd been born here, raised here, believed in American principles. But I was also Japanese. I spoke the language, understood the culture, carried the heritage in my face and name. Was it possible to be both, or did war force you to choose, to cut away half of yourself to prove loyalty to the other half? I found Major Patterson in his office, working through paperwork by lamplight. He looked up when I entered, saw something in my face, and gestured for me to sit. "What's eating you, Nakamura?" "Sir, am I a traitor?" He blinked, surprised by the question. "What? Who the hell told you that?" "Lieutenant Ito. He called me Hancho, traitor to Japanese people. He said I betray my heritage by serving America, by helping kill Japanese soldiers." Patterson was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out a bottle of whiskey from his desk drawer. Against regulations, but nobody cared much about regulations in a field hospital on Saipan. "My grandfather fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War," he said, pouring 2 glasses. "He believed in states' rights, in Southern independence. He killed Union soldiers who were Americans just like him. Then the war ended, the Confederacy lost, and he had to figure out how to be American again after fighting against America." He pushed a glass toward me. "You know what he figured out? That fighting for what you believe is right isn't betrayal, even when it puts you against people who share your blood." He believed the Confederacy was right. He was wrong about that. But his belief was genuine. You believe America is right. Maybe you're wrong sometimes too. God knows America makes mistakes, like those damn internment camps. But your belief is genuine. "But these soldiers," I gestured toward the ward, "they speak my language, they have my face, they could be my family. And yet they're fighting for an empire that started this war, that's conquered half of Asia, that's committed atrocities across the Pacific, Patterson interrupted. Just because they look like you doesn't make their cause right. Just because you look like them doesn't make your loyalty suspect. He downed his whiskey in one gulp. You're not a traitor, Nakamura. You're a man caught between two identities, trying to honor both while serving one. That's not betrayal, that's complexity. That's being human. His words helped, but they didn't solve the fundamental conflict. I was still American soldier and Japanese translator, enemy and brother, loyal and traitorous depending on who was judging me. The resolution came in November, in a way I never expected. Corporal Yamamoto, whose life I'd helped save by convincing him to accept treatment, had recovered enough to move around the ward with crutches. He'd become friendly with some of the American medics, learning basic English and teaching them Japanese phrases. The hatred, the rigid ideology of Japanese superiority, it had started to crack when faced with daily kindness from the enemy. One evening he approached me with something in his hand, a letter he'd written to his mother in Japan, though he knew it would never be sent. Nakamura-san, he said formally, I wish to apologize. For what, Yamamoto-san? When I first saw you, I thought you were Hancho, traitor, Japanese man wearing enemy uniform. But I watch you for 2 months now, and I understand something. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You are not betraying Japanese. You are also not betraying American. You are being both, carrying both identities with honor. This is harder than being only one thing. This requires more strength, more courage than I ever understood. He bowed formally, with the respect due to a superior despite my lower rank. You show me that identity is not a simple thing. I am Japanese soldier, but I am also human being who wants to live, to see mother again, to rebuild life after war. You teach me that these things do not contradict, that I can be Japanese and also grateful to Americans who saved my life. Tears were streaming down his face now. You are bridge, Nakamura-san. Bridge between Japanese and American, between enemy and friend, between war and peace. This is holy work. Harder than fighting, more important than killing. I understand now. His words broke something open in me that had been locked tight since the war started. I wasn't a traitor. I wasn't betraying either identity. I was exactly what Yamamoto said, a bridge between worlds, carrying both identities and trying to honor both even when they conflicted. The work became easier after that realization. I was still American soldier, but I treated Japanese prisoners with the respect I'd want for my own father if he'd been captured. I was still Japanese descendant, but I served America because I genuinely believed in American principles, even when America failed to live up to them. I convinced more prisoners to accept treatment by explaining that surviving with honor was possible, that Bushido, the samurai code, allowed for adaptation to circumstances beyond your control. I helped American doctors understand Japanese cultural context that affected treatment. I became the bridge that both sides needed, even if neither fully trusted me. By December 1944, the hospital ward had become something unusual, a place where former enemies were learning to see each other as human beings. American medics who'd called prisoners Japs now used their names. Japanese soldiers who'd expected torture were accepting treatment and even joking with the medics in broken English. One afternoon in late December, I was translating for a medic treating Sergeant Kobayashi's infected stump where his arm had been amputated. A young Marine, Private Danny Chen, was watching from the doorway. He was Chinese-American, also facing prejudice because Americans couldn't tell Asian faces apart, also trying to prove his loyalty. "Sarge," he said to me after the treatment, "how do you do it? How do you stay sane working with them when they killed so many Americans? How do you stay sane, Private, when Americans think you might be Japanese just because you have an Asian face?" He blinked, surprised by the question. "We're all caught between identities," I continued. "You're American, but Americans see Chinese face and suspect you. I'm American, but I have Japanese face and speak Japanese language. These prisoners are Japanese, but they're learning that Americans aren't the demons they were told about. None of us fit into simple categories. So what do? We be human first," I said. "We treat others like human beings, regardless of their uniform or face or language. We remember that war makes us enemies, but our common humanity is stronger than any ideology." The work continued through January 1945. More prisoners arrived as fighting continued across the Pacific. Some died despite our best efforts. Others recovered and were shipped to POW camps in Hawaii or the mainland. A few, like Yamamoto and Kobayashi, became something close to friends, enemy soldiers who'd been taught to hate Americans, but who'd learned through pain and kindness that the enemy had the same hopes and fears and humanity as anyone else. Lieutenant Ito, the officer who'd called me traitor, took the longest to come around. He maintained rigid military bearing, refused to engage with American medics beyond what was absolutely necessary, and treated me with open contempt for weeks. Then, in late January, word reached Saipan about the liberation of Manila in the Philippines. The stories coming out were horrific. Japanese soldiers had massacred civilians, committed atrocities against Filipino families, destroyed a city rather than surrender it intact. I watched Ito's face as another Japanese prisoner translated the radio news, watched something break in his expression. "This is not what we were supposed to be," he whispered in Japanese. "We were supposed to bring Asian co-prosperity, to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. Instead, we became monsters." That night, he asked to speak with me privately. "Nakamura-san," he said formally, "I owe you apology. I called you traitor for serving America, for helping enemy. But I see now that you are not traitor. You are honest man trying to serve principles you believe in." He paused, struggling with something painful. "I served Japan because I believed we were right, that we were liberating Asia, that our cause was just, but Manila, the things our soldiers did, if this is what serving Japan means, then maybe being Japanese is not enough. Maybe principles matter more than blood." "I'm sorry, Lieutenant," I said, and I meant it. Sorry that he had to face the reality of his country's crimes. Sorry that belief in a just cause had been shattered by evidence of atrocities. Sorry that we were both caught between loyalties and identities that refused to align neatly. "You carry two identities," he continued, "Japanese and American. I thought this made you weak, divided, traitorous. But I see now it makes you stronger. You can be loyal to principles rather than to blood, to ideals rather than to flags. This is wisdom I never learned in all my military training." I received orders to ship out in early February 1945. The hospital was being reorganized, and I was being sent to Okinawa to prepare for the invasion as part of the translation team. My time as a medical interpreter was ending. On my last day, the Japanese prisoners who could walk assembled in the ward to say goodbye. Yamamoto, recovered and preparing for transfer to a POW camp in Hawaii, presented me with a small origami crane he'd folded from a piece of medical gauze. "In Japan, we believe 1,000 cranes bring good fortune and long life," he said in careful English he'd been practicing. "I cannot make 1,000, but I make this one for you, Nakamura-san. You give me life. You show me that enemy can be brother, that American can be Japanese, that war does not destroy all humanity." Kobayashi, the sergeant who'd lost his arm, bowed formally despite his disability. "You are samurai," he said in Japanese, "not because you fight with sword, but because you maintain honor in impossible situation. You serve two masters, Japanese heritage and American loyalty, without betraying either. This is highest form of Bushido." Even Lieutenant Ito approached, maintaining military bearing, but with something softer in his eyes. "You taught me that identity is choice, not blood," he said quietly. "That Japanese man can serve America with honor, that principles matter more than ancestry. I do not know yet what I believe about this war, about my service, about my country's actions. But I know you are not traitor. You are man who found way to be true to both parts of yourself. This is lesson I will carry with me." I left Saipan in February 1945 with that origami crane carefully preserved in my pocket, with letters from Japanese prisoners thanking me for treating them as human beings, with an understanding of identity that was vastly more complex and nuanced than anything I'd believed before. I served as interpreter through the Okinawa campaign, watching the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War claim over 100,000 lives on both sides. I watched Japanese civilians commit suicide rather than surrender to Americans they'd been taught to fear. I watched American soldiers, brutalized by years of war, committing acts that shamed our cause. I watched the humanity drain out of everyone as the war ground on. But I also watched American medics trying to save Japanese civilian lives, even while fighting Japanese soldiers. I watched Japanese soldiers, given the chance, choosing surrender over suicide when they understood they'd be treated humanely. I watched small moments of human kindness breaking through the machinery of death, proving that war couldn't completely destroy our common humanity. The war ended in August 1945 with atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, my parents' homeland, vaporized in instants, killing hundreds of thousands, including possibly relatives I'd never met. The news shattered something in me, made me question everything about the war, about loyalty, about the price of victory. My family was released from Manzanar in November 1945, returning to Los Angeles to find our home had been sold. Papa's business was gone, and the community we'd known had been scattered. They'd lost 3 years of their lives, imprisoned without charges, released without apologies. I was discharged in December 1945, returning to a family that was broken, a community that was devastated, and a country that still wasn't sure Japanese Americans were truly American. But I also returned with letters from Japanese prisoners whose lives I'd helped save, with an understanding that identity is fluid rather than fixed, with the knowledge that being caught between two worlds isn't weakness. It's a unique form of strength. I received letters over the years from some of the prisoners. Yamamoto wrote from Osaka, where he'd returned to his family farm and was teaching English to Japanese children, telling them that Americans weren't demons, but just people. Kobayashi wrote from Tokyo, where he worked as a translator, helping with the American occupation, using his experience to bridge cultures just as I had. Lieutenant Ito's letter came in 1952, 7 years after the war ended. He'd become a professor of comparative literature, teaching Japanese students about American culture and American students about Japanese traditions. "You showed me," he wrote, "that the highest loyalty is not to nation or race, but to principles that transcend both. I spend my life now trying to build bridges between cultures, as you did in that hospital ward when you could have treated us as enemies. I never became the doctor I'd dreamed of being before the war. Medical school seemed impossible after years of combat and trauma. Instead, I became a translator, a cultural consultant, someone who helped Japanese and Americans understand each other in the difficult years after the war. I spent 40 years building bridges between the two cultures that formed my identity, teaching Japanese Americans that we didn't have to choose one identity over the other, teaching Americans that Japanese faces didn't make us enemies, teaching Japanese that American culture wasn't purely foreign or hostile. Looking back now, I realized that those months as a medical interpreter on Saipan were the most important of my life. Not my combat service, not my intelligence work, but those days spent talking to wounded Japanese prisoners, helping them see Americans as human and helping Americans see Japanese as human. War tried to force me to choose, American or Japanese, loyal or traitorous, friend or enemy. But I learned that the strongest position isn't choosing one or the other. It's holding both, being the bridge that allows others to cross the divide between cultures, nations, and ideologies. I was programmed to kill Japanese soldiers. Instead, I learned to heal them as brothers, and in healing them, I healed something in myself, the false divide between my two identities, the belief that I had to choose one or reject the other, the fear that being both made me neither. I am American, I am Japanese. Both truths are complete, both identities are real, and carrying both with honor is not betrayal. It's the hardest and most important work I've ever done. This was the story of Sergeant Kenji Redemption Nakamura, 442nd Regimental Combat Team and Military Intelligence Service, who learned that identity is not either or but both, and that loyalty to principles transcends loyalty to blood, and that the true battlefield is not between nations but between our capacity for hatred and our capacity for recognizing common humanity. His service, documented in military records and confirmed by letters from grateful prisoners, reminds us that even in war's worst moments, individuals can choose to be bridges instead of barriers, healers instead of killers, human beings first and soldiers second. Kenji's transformation from angry volunteer, determined to prove his American loyalty by killing Japanese soldiers, to compassionate interpreter who treated enemy wounded as brothers, demonstrates that our identities are not fixed by birth or blood, that we can honor multiple heritages simultaneously, and that the courage to remain human in war is greater than the courage to kill. What struck you most about Kenji's story? Have you heard similar accounts from Japanese American veterans or others caught between conflicting identities during war? These personal stories help us understand not just what happened during World War II, but how individuals navigated the impossible choices that war creates about loyalty, identity, and humanity. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Captain Margaret Angel O'Brien, an army nurse who discovered that caring for enemy wounded sometimes meant protecting them from Allied soldiers seeking revenge. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.